Counter-Narrative News, bringing you a special episode commemorating the expulsion of the US and British military bases from Libya. Around this time, March the 28th, 1970, the British were expelled by the new Pan-African, Pan-Arabist socialist regime of the September 1969 revolution led by Muammar Gaddafi and other military officers. We're going to quote from probably the best book, having read most books about Libya and the context of the Jamahirian state of Muammar Gaddafi. This is probably the best book. Actually, it's probably head and shoulders the best book. It has a wealth of information. It's well researched. It's not prejudiced, leading to blind spots and terrible distortions. It's by Jonathan Behrman, published by Z Books in 1986, called Gaddafi's Libya. Also, Z Books have an incredible treasure trove of archived books reporting and researching on the most significant Third World revolutionary struggles through the 60s, 70s into the 80s. Z Books has transferred ownership to another private company recently, and before Z Books had their office and archive in North Lambeth around the Vauxhall Oval area, and one could access those archives there. It seems that those archives are now relatively more inaccessible, but it's important that people try to access that, because there's so much important knowledge in those books. And also, one has to state that one also tried to reach out and find Jonathan Behrman, the author of what we're about to quote in this Gaddafi's Libya book, published by Z Books in 1986. We tried to contact Jonathan Behrman around the NATO destruction of Libya in 2011 to no avail. So if anyone knows where Jonathan Behrman might be, if he's still on this plane on the earth, please do signpost him to us. It would be good to be in touch with him. So this is the expulsion of the bases. A few things just before quoting here. The US and British military bases in Libya were some of the biggest military bases they had anywhere in the world. Libya was just totally trod upon in the most racist colonial manner by the British and US colonial forces, particularly around the Second World War. If you watch any of the films about the war against the Axis power by the Allied powers in the Second World War based in Libya, you can see that the Libyan people are basically treated as a non-people. They're just treated as this kind of totally peripheral beings that could literally be trampled on by the warring parties. A really horrific manner in which Libyans were treated. And Libya, yes, was veritably the poorest nation in the world before the socialist revolution of September 1969 took over. Anyway, to the quoting the book, it's part of the chapter called Beginning of the Revolution and a subheading called The Expulsion of the Bases. By the by, the RCC is the Revolutionary Command Council, which is the revolutionary body which led the Libyan Arab Republic from 1969 to 1977. Quote, for Libya's strategic patrons, Britain and the United States, the anti-colonial course embarked on by the new authorities had its most immediate and devastating impact in the elimination of their military bases. These were of no minor significance. The British and American military facilities in Libya added an extra dimension to the Western NATO alliance, particularly regarding possible intervention in the region. The ranges around Wheelersfield and Al-Adem were unrivaled in the scope they offered for military exercises, while the RAF and the USAF benefited from near-perfect conditions for low-level flying runs with live ammunition. In Cyrenaica, the British retained access to terrain ideal for large-scale military manoeuvres. British and American resistance to the new regime's stated intention of expelling the foreign military presence was expected. For the United States in particular, the closure of Wheelers Field will be a strategic loss, affecting their military capacity in the region at a time when the Soviet presence in Egypt was growing. The threat to the bases was the main concern in London and Washington after the sudden deposition of the monarchy. Indeed, the British and Americans, in eschewing precipitous action in support of the Idris regime, had hoped to safeguard the future of their facilities in a fresh agreement with the new authorities. There was no guarantee, once the RCC's official position had become clear, that either country would comply without the exercise of force. Despite the pro forma denials of the British Foreign Office, it was common knowledge in the Arab world that the British had a contingency plan for intervention in Libya. As part of the 1953 Anglo-Libya Treaty, a secret protocol was attached providing for the invasion of Libya in case of an emergency. Details of the plan, codenamed Operation Radford, were obtained by the Egyptians in 1965 from an archivist at the British Ministry of Defence. Published in full in Al-Ahram, the plan called for the movement of British troops from Germany, Malta and Cyprus in order to defend the king and restore order. According to Mohammed Haikal, Al-Ahram's editor, the contingency scheme was intended precisely for the situation which had occurred in Libya. What deterred the British was the speed and decisiveness with which the three officers acted. Had a prolonged struggle ensued, Britain and the United States would have been handed a pretext for intervention. In Gaddafi, the British and Americans were faced with a new leader who would brook no compromise. In his keynote speech in Tripoli on 16th of October, Gaddafi boldly pledged that he would turn the country into a battlefield if the British and Americans failed to withdraw by reasonable means. 2 weeks later, on 29th of October, the RCC made its first formal approach to Britain on the subject, demanded the prompt evacuation of British forces from Libyan territory. The British, under the Defence Minister Denis Healey, assessed the situation carefully. Loss of the training grounds in Cyrenaica was considered damaging, but there seemed no alternative to acquiescence. The experience of Suez and the Algerian Civil War warned against further colonial adventures. The Wilson government responded with a call for talks. These lasted for 2 sessions, a total of 6 hours. At the first meeting on December the 8th, the British ambassador Donald Maitland was instructed to concede the principle of withdrawal. After that, it was simply a question of working out the details. At the second session, a week later, Maitland announced a departure deadline of 31st of March 1970. Even before the talks had commenced, the British had reduced their presence at Al-Adem and Tobruk from 2,000 in October to 1,000 in December. Enforcing the issue, the Libyans had adeptly deployed a number of powerful bargaining counters. The most important was their ability, particularly injurious in a rising oil power, to threaten the withdrawal of their sterling balances standing at £384 million. If that proved insufficient, they could also initiate the revision of the dispensable contracts and nationalise British Petroleum and other British interests in Libya. The British, on the other hand, were in a relatively weak position. They could only counter Libya with a threat to suspend the contract for the supply of 200 chiefs and tanks ordered by the previous regime to boost the Libyan armed forces' ground capacity. It was a defiant gesture unlikely to be effective. At the time, British overseas military commitments were under general review as the Labour government began Britain's retreat from east of Suez. The British were simply disinclined for an entanglement with another nationalist government. Maitland's mission, as far as Whitehall was concerned, was to urge on the Libyans a joint communique emphasising the mutual benefits of further Anglo-Libyan cooperation. For London, it was a question of damage control, chiefly to protect the extensive British economic interests. Flush with success, the RCC turned its attention to the evacuation of the American airbase at Wheelers Field. Talks commenced in December, soon after the British had conceded, but not without much disquiet at the prospect of handing over the sophisticated base, the regional headquarters of the USAF, to a radical Arab regime. Indeed, had it seemed probable that the Libyans would hand over facilities to the Soviet Union, the Nixon administration may have balked at the withdrawal, but Gaddafi was insistent that Libya would not open the facilities to other foreign powers. Revolutionary Libya will never substitute a foreigner for another foreigner or an intruder for another intruder, he was quoted as saying in the Libyan Mail in May 1970. In any event, Britain's decision to withdraw had already pulled the rug from under the feet of the Americans, so Washington submitted. On the 24th of September, the day after the British announced their withdrawal, a joint Libyan-American statement tersely announced that the United States would follow suit by 30th of June. In fact, the American evacuation, like the British, was carried out before the deadline and with a minimum of fuss. The British finally left Libya on the 28th of March, and the Americans completed their withdrawal on the 11th of June. It was a historic achievement. Celebrating a victory over imperialism, the revolutionary authorities renamed Al-Adem Air Base Gamal Abdel Nasser Air Base and Wheelers Field Okba bin Nafi Air Base after one of the regional Arab conquerors of Libya. Any hope that either country had of maintaining some military influence in Libya through supply and training arrangements was soon dissipated. On 29th of December, following up their initial success, the RCC cancelled the former regime's contract with the British Aircraft Corporation for the Thunderbird and Rapier missile systems, which were of no use to the country except in a Western-backed conflict with its Arab neighbours. In retaliation, the British held up delivery of the chieftains. The RCC, not to be blackmailed, demanded back various down payments and began a major review of arms supply policy. In November, the first tentative approaches were made to the French government as an alternative arms supplier. The Libyans asked to purchase Dassault Mirage planes earmarked for Israel, embargoed because of the 1967 war. The prospect of such a sale to an Arab country not actually covered by the embargo was too attractive to be ignored. The French saw in it a means to extend their influence in North Africa at the expense of the British and Americans. On 9th of January 1970, the conclusion of the deal was announced. France agreed to sell Libya an initial 50 Mirage V aircraft, 15 to be delivered by 1971. The Libyans wanted these highly coveted French warplanes to rebuild the Arab arsenal in the confrontation with Israel. Nasser viewed Libya as a conduit for arms that were otherwise blocked by the Western arms embargo. While the negotiation was still taking place, he told Gaddafi, "If you can get Phantoms and Mirages, this will be a colossal addition to Arab strength." The performance of the Israeli Mirages in the June 1967 war had been outstanding. The surprise attacks, which wiped out most of the Egyptian Air Force while still on the ground, were led by squadrons of Mirage fighters. Thanks to France, the Arabs would now have access to the same level of technology as the Zionists, instead of the usual disparity in the air. Vigorous protest naturally followed. The British and Americans were enraged at the blatant opportunism of the French. Both countries had decided to pass up lavish arms contracts with the new Libyan regime precisely because they did not want to shift the balance of forces in favour of the Arabs. They were in favour of Israel's military superiority. The French, ambitious to become the leading arms supplier in the Arab world, ignored this hypocrisy on the part of the British and Americans. On 22nd of January, the French Minister of Defense, Michel Debré, announced that the arms deal was expanded to include the supply of 30 Mirage 111E interceptors and 20 Mirage 111B and 111R trainers. The planes would come armed with Matraf 530 air-to-air missiles. In addition, France agreed to start training Libyan pilots at Wheelers Field, then still in the process of being evacuated. It was to be the largest ever single arms agreement yet secured by the French. With the final addition of the Team Mirage 111E interceptors on the 31st of January, the package totaled 110 warplanes. It was astronomically expensive, and the cost of operational maintenance would be much higher. But in the Libya of 1970, funds for the defense of the Libyan interests were ample. No conditions were attached to their use in the Middle East conflict other than they must be based and maintained in Libya. The only real restrictions applied to their use in a clash with the French client states in Africa. The deal was another triumph for the revolutionary authorities. Not only had the RCC expelled the foreign bases, it had dramatically ended its military dependence on Britain and the United States. Britain had lost its place as the leading supplier of the Libyan army and navy, and the United States had been ousted from its role as the main contractor for the Libyan Air Force. The switch in arms purchase to France permitted the RCC greater room to maneuver in pursuit of its nationalist objectives. The British attempt to hold the new Libyan political leadership to ransom with the suspension of the Chieftain tank contract rebounded on Whitehall. The revolutionary authorities succeeded in their most important goal. The British and American military stranglehold on Libya was broken. End of quote. So lots of fascinating things there in terms of playing off the colonial powers in a radical, socialist-oriented, pan-Arab, pan-Africanist strategy by the Libyan authorities, playing off the French against the British and the United States. Absolutely correct approach there. The building up of the military capacity for the pan-Arab front against Western colonialism and its forward kind of states there, particularly Israel, but also the Gulf monarchies, is also really interesting in that regards. And it all really interestingly informs what happens in 2011. One remembers meeting Lord Ahmed in the House of Lords during the NATO conflict against Libya. So Lord Ahmed would boast that he helped to raise the Union Jack in the rapprochement at the end of the 90s, representing the New Labour neo-colonial regime with the Libyan authorities. And then when one put it to Lord Ahmed that the British had tricked Libya and set them up to be destroyed in this military campaign, Lord Ahmed literally went greyish white as a sheet. In more recent developments, Lord Ahmed has been implicated in sexual abuse of minors, if one remembers correctly, and is serving some jail time there. Well, that is very much reflective of the type of behaviour that goes on in the mother of all colonial nonsense, which are the Houses of Parliament in London. But so there's a lot of ramifications there. It's really interesting. This is a period of radical revolutionary anti-colonial socialist upsurge, and in that context the British authorities and the US clearly didn't want another major mass-based revolutionary insurgency against it, as was raging across the world in many places against it anyway, so they sought to minimize and conduct some strategic damage limitation there. Really fascinating things. Hope that's of some use and historical understanding, informing a political consciousness today, because as Muammar Gaddafi said, and he was true to his word, he never replaced one foreign occupation with another. He never actually allowed the Chinese or the Russians, for example, to have a military foothold in Libya, when some people, including some Libyans, argue that it would have been beneficial to Libya in what actually happened with the NATO attempt to destroy it, which happened, that some Libyans argue that it would have helped to have a Russian military base, for example, in Libya. But then other Libyans, and maybe more Libyans, reflect on the Russian intervention in Syria and how it's turned Syria into a absolutely weakened vassal state, dangling on a string, the string held by the Russians, who invited the occupiers to partition Syria in the form of the US occupation and partition of Syria, and the Turkish invasion and occupation and partition of Syria. So many Libyans reflect, well, that wouldn't have been much use to us anyway. And then one can reflect that during the conflict, China and Russia were very happy to firmly sit on their hands and watch Libya be destroyed, and Russia came in vulture-like to pick off the corpse, which was the metaphorical body of Libya after NATO destroyed it, and then to ally, that's the Putin leadership, to ally with the long-term CIA asset, General Haftar, and then to send in its racist death squads to kill those families supportive of the socialist Jamahiriya Gaddafi. The Wagner have killed civilians in Sirte and have looted Libya and other African states. Lots of challenges remaining forward as we go forward, and it's really important we really interrogate and kind of look into and engage with these issues to have a much better analysis strategically for the rights of the workers and peasants and the oppressed and exploited in the global south going forward. Many thanks.